But we gave the police everything they asked for: blood samples, DNA samples, whatever they asked for, records, all of our credit card, anything they asked for, we gave them. Male DNA found in a sexual assault case is a huge clue, and to discount it is absurd.
And Boulder police say the claim that there is evidence and leads they're not pursuing, including DNA testing, is, quote, completely false.
They were told in January by their lab, we tested the DNA, there's unidentified male DNA, which excludes the parents and the son, Burke. They were told that in January. They kept that secret from the media and from the district attorney for months.
6 months to be exact. But I think if we're going to talk about keeping things secret, we need to maintain perspective. How long was the grand jury decision kept secret? 6 months. Well, try 14 years. And just think about how massively the public and the media were misled by that. Now, incredibly, and perhaps for the first time in 20 or more years, Boulder PD have broken their silence early and actually responded to John's shouts from the rooftops.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Now, I am going to play you the response from the Boulder PD. It's actually a response they gave on camera. But do you remember the slide I showed you in the previous video from Netflix showing Pat Corton and a statement he released? This was right in the beginning, in the first few months, possibly even in January, that the makers of the Netflix production actually narrated Corton's script. That is how important it was, and I guess they feel it still is, 28 years later, to the Ramsey Apologia. We are anxious for that material to come back because we believe strongly that it will enable the police to take the family off the potential suspect list, and this is in terms of the DNA evidence. Now, the DNA narrative can get quite technical. So before we swoop down into the forest and start walking between the trees, looking under leaves and going down microscopic rabbit holes, let's examine a few broad strokes. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. May I recommend, of the many books I've written on this case, I can't recommend more highly the Day After Christmas series. All 3 books, it's a trilogy, all 3 books have got well over 4 out of 5 in terms of star ratings. And I have to say, even though I wrote the book with Lisa Wilson, when I was doing the audiobook, I was even blown away by the research, just the level of detail and analysis in those narratives. A lot of it has been completely forgotten about. So I really do recommend that. I'll put a link to the trilogy in the description. I do want to thank the handful of you who have responded to my appeal that you hit the thanks button. I really do appreciate it. Remember, I don't really do live streams, so if you can make a contribution, I'd really appreciate it, and let's get started. Now, first of all, the fact that Boulder PD have been drawn out to respond to John's grandstanding, if that's what it is brilliant, because I think for far too long the Ramseys have been able to depend on the silence of Boulder PD, no matter what they say. And John has been quite clear. He's doing all this, he says, to put pressure on Boulder PD, because for some strange reason, they aren't doing, apparently, what he feels that they should do or are supposed to do. Is that true, though? And I think we have to ask a separate question. Why is John doing this? Why is he so active 28 years later? Because there were long periods of silence. So why is John so vocal at this point? And he says it's about pressuring the police through the media. But it seems to me a better way to get results would be for the former suspect to talk to the police, to go to Boulder, not to talk to the media, not to make himself and others available to, like making documentaries and talking to YouTubers. Go and talk to the police. So often when he does give these interviews and he's asked specific questions, he says he doesn't know. And so I think we do need to ask, why is John doing this? And we're going to look into that in a lot of detail very soon. Now, first I want to explain Boulder PD's protocols in terms of discussing this case. Every year around Christmas, Boulder PD do typically release a fairly generic online update on the Ramsey case. You virtually never hear from them for the rest of the year in terms of the Ramsey case, although not long ago there were a few new developments, new people coming into Boulder PD after Tom Trujillo's retirement. That was in mid-February of this year, you might remember. And John Ramsey spoke about that at the time, I think implying that Trujillo's departure might lead to change at Boulder PD. Incidentally, Trujillo was one of the cops who interviewed Patsy and John Ramsey way back in 1997, alongside Detective Steve Thomas. And he was actually picked by the district attorney's office. He was handpicked by the district attorney's office to do that, as I understand it. Now, personally, I don't think Trujillo did a particularly good job in either of those interviews. That's just my opinion. We also heard recently that the Boulder PD had digitized the entire case file, and I can tell you, if you know about that case file, you know what a huge project that had to be, that whole filing and indexing process. And there's a certain amount of reviewing that took place during that process of the DNA evidence. Now, hours ago, something very rare has taken place. No less than Boulder Police Chief Stephen Redfern has made a brief, barely 2-minute statement on camera. That's also unusual. On camera from his office as a sort of terse rebuttal to the goings-on, thanks to John stirring up the courts of public opinion on Netflix and YouTube. Let's listen in.
My name is Stephen Redfern.
Leading Boulder Police to release their annual update on the case a month early.
There are a number of things that people have pointed to throughout the years that could have been done better, and we acknowledge that is true.
The chief says the Colorado Cold Case Review Team digitized all their evidence into a searchable database.
But the part I want to highlight that's pertinent both to this Netflix series but also beyond that is this comment that he makes about documenting more than 1 million pages in this investigation.
More than 21,000 tips, over 1,000 interviews, which were conducted across 17 states and 2 foreign countries, samples from more than 200 different individuals, including handwriting, DNA, fingerprints, and shoe prints, nearly 2,500 pieces of evidence, and roughly 40,000 reports, with more than 1 million pages documenting the investigation.
Yet I must report to you that I and my prosecution task force believe we do not have sufficient evidence to warrant the filing of charges against anyone who has been investigated at this time.
With more than 1 million pages documenting the investigation.
Believe we do not have sufficient evidence.
Nearly 2,500 pieces of evidence.
We do not have sufficient evidence.
Over 1,000 interviews.
We do not have sufficient evidence.
It's very interesting to me the way Alex Hunter is portrayed as the good guy in the Netflix documentary, and yet he's conspicuously missing. He's the good guy, and the Boulder PD are the bad guys. But John would say, because Hunter supports his case, I mean, he hired Lou Smith to investigate the defense case. Do you know that? To only look into the intruder theory. They didn't hire Smith and say, hey, draw your own conclusions. He was hired specifically, pertinently, to investigate the intruder theory, the defense case. I also want to talk about John Tracy and other arch Ramsey apologists that you see in the Netflix series. And I have to say I was appalled to see the director actually included them in this revisionist history of the Ramsey case. You really get the feeling some people will do anything in order to be able to rub shoulders somehow, and somehow almost like inveigle themselves, make themselves relevant to this case, even when they are totally immaterial to it. And I think it's also important to look at people that they approached who didn't want to participate, like Detective Steve Thomas, but also those they didn't even think to approach, like what about the Ramsey housekeeper? Now, I want to be clear about this mystery DNA found in JonBenét's underwear. Like, do people struggle with selective recall? Do people have like large gaping holes in their memory base, in their knowledge base, or both? You do know that whatever underwear JonBenét was wearing at the time she was murdered, was believed to be removed, that she was wiped down, and this was the finding of the coroner, that she appeared to have been redressed in size 12 bloomers. Does that ring a bell? Ever heard that somewhere before? Is that mentioned in the series? These bloomers were a few sizes too big for her. You do know that. And this is an excerpt from the official autopsy report. The long underwear are urine stained anteriorly over the crotch area and anterior legs. No defects are identified. Beneath the long underwear are white panties with printed rosebuds and the words Wednesday on the elastic waistband. The underwear is urine stained, and in the inner aspect of the crotch are several red areas, etc., etc. Now, you do know that Patsy recognized those bloomers. She was asked about it in April during that first official police interview. She was asked about these bloomers, and she said that she recognized them as a gift, as I recall, one that was intended for JonBenét's older half-sister, Melinda, right? Now, this is an excerpt from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. In addition, JonBenét's underpants bore stains that appeared to be blood. The corresponding areas of her skin in the pubic area, however, showed no matching stains. Interesting, isn't it? The coroner told the police that the blood smears on the skin and the fibers found in the folds indicated that the child's area had been wiped with a cloth. The blood smears also contained traces of fibers. So we're talking about unknown male DNA evidence in some item that was part of a cover-up anyway. And why on earth would a stranger in the home commit an act, JonBenét screams, and then still find the time to change her clothing? I mean, how would he even know where to find it? And wouldn't that presuppose him going back upstairs? What's also crazy is the Ramseys used the fence that the police allowed the crime scene to be contaminated. And of course, John himself did plenty of interfering and contaminating the crime scene himself, removing the duct tape, taking the string off her hands, transporting her upstairs, even putting a blanket, which would have been filled with fibers, over her, and contaminating the crime scene himself. But when it comes to DNA evidence, then suddenly there's no contamination and it's a DNA case. And oh, by the way, we've forgotten about these bloomers that weren't the original underwear that she was wearing. Isn't that important? So do you see there's a lot more to the DNA narrative than just this one sample? And there's a lot more to the Ramsey case than just DNA. And what about everything else? What about the fiber narrative? What about the other clothing that was found in the wine cellar and the DNA traces on those? Or are we just going to focus on one little thing and make our entire case about that? That's really reductionist, and that's overly simplistic as well. And you see the exact same defense narrative in the Amanda Knox case. Now, before concluding, I want to address the statement that John makes in the Netflix series.
But we gave the police everything they asked for: blood samples, DNA samples, whatever they asked for, records, all of our credit card, anything they asked for, we gave to them.
Now, I'll talk at further length about this in another episode, but actually the phone records the cops received were extremely limited, ditto the bank records. For now, though, let's just look at a quick excerpt from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. The most elementary of investigative efforts, such as obtaining telephone and credit card records, were met without support, search warrants denied. The significant opinions of national experts were casually dismissed or ignored by the district attorney's office. Even the experienced FBI were waved aside. This was the attitude, quite cynical in my opinion, of the district attorney's office at the time in terms of investigating this case.
But we gave the police everything they asked for. Anything they asked for, we gave to them.
Okay, well, how about them asking to interview the Ramseys on the night that JonBenét was found? Well, the Ramseys put up a 4-month-long obstacle course before that happened. Do you know about that story? Some incredible things happened in the run-up to those interviews. Just that story is quite interesting. The Ramseys and their lawyers were provided with the police reports in advance of those interviews. Why would you need that? That is something that's usually unthinkable in these sorts of situations. Let's go back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. In a departure from protocol, police reports, physical evidence, and investigative information were shared with Ramsey defense attorneys All of this in the District Attorney's Office spirit of cooperation. I was advised, and I think this is the author referring to himself, not to speak to certain witnesses, and all but dissuaded from pursuing on and on. Okay, and then the Ramseys also set some tough conditions to the cops before they agreed to be interviewed. So even though they were provided with all of this stuff, they, in addition to that, set some really tough conditions.
The Ramsey attorneys negotiated stiff ground rules. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Pitt helped prepare the interview team.
It was agreed that the interviews would not take place on the grounds of the Boulder Police Department.
And the interviews would be done by the DA's investigators. Another condition, Dr. Pitt and the Boulder police detectives on the case would not be allowed to see the interviews live, only on tape shuttled back hours later. So they had no way to suggest follow-up questions.
Sounds like the Ramseys or their attorneys drove a pretty hard bargain.
Every town has its top 1% in lawyers, and their lawyers did great by then.
The interviews took place 19 months after JonBenét's murder. Lou Smith, the father of the intruder theory, interviewed John Ramsey. It was cordial.
And if you were listening carefully, you probably picked up that that was a reference to the second set of interviews from 1998. So there's actually a much longer narrative that deals with the marathon of discussions that eventually led to the first police interview, and then more than a year went by before there was a second police interview. I've only provided the basics here, but I do think you need to think about this when you hear John saying, we gave the police everything they asked for, and anything they asked, we gave to them. I think you need to bear that context in mind. I think one thing they definitely didn't give was permission for JonBenét's body to be exhumed. So I don't know if you can make a global statement like we gave them anything they asked for. They certainly didn't give them permission to exhume JonBenét's body. And you might say, I agree with the reasons for that, but then don't make a blanket statement that we gave them whatever they wanted. Also, when I refer to this article by the Daily Camera, JonBenét's parents questioned, this is from May 1st, 1997. More than 4 months after John Ramsey found his 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét, murdered in the family's upscale Boulder home, police investigators conducted long-awaited individual interviews Wednesday with the slain beauty queen's parents. There was a lot of fighting going on between police and the Ramseys last week about interrogating the Ramseys, but police finally got to officially talk to them about the details of the day the body was found and other things like family history, a source said. It's also interesting that they talked to Patsy for about 6 hours in that first interview and John only for about 2. That already indicates what the thrust of the investigation was in the first months of 1997. I also want to take you to John's interview with Crime Junkie, where John selectively only provides a portion of the DNA story, and to her credit, Ashley Flowers then adds the next part of that narrative.
Well, it does matter. Male DNA found in a sexual assault case is a huge clue. And to discount it is absurd.
And they do eventually go back and get another sample that they put in the CODIS from it.
Now, I think it's interesting as she's trying to make her point, like the other side of the story, John actually interrupts her. Now, I want to conclude by asking you a question. I want you to do some of your own statement analysis. What do you think of this statement by Ramsey private investigator John San Augustin, which also comes up in the Netflix series? I think it's near the end of episode 1.
And there is absolutely zero innocent explanation for foreign DNA to end up on a 6-year-old's underwear. There's no innocent explanation.
How about that?
Yeah, how is that for a cliffhanger? That's essentially how the first episode of the 3 episodes ends on that note. And they actually show the original panties that are found at the crime scene, but without giving too much information about it. Okay, so what do you think about that? Let me know in the comments. I will obviously be continuing my analysis of certain parts from the series, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.